Good morning. This is John Nebeker. I'm here for the Potpourri today. Today's lecture, or kind of a fun thing, is Icelanders of Utah County. And there's a reason for that because my mother was Icelandic and I'm 50% Icelandic. And we have a great organization here in the Spanish Fork area. I have Richard Williams here to give a presentation on it, but I want to give you an idea of something. My grandmother's name, if you ever try to pronounce Icelandic, it's really a tongue twister. My mother's name is Bjorn Bjrnsson. And my grandmother, that was my great grandmother. My grandmother, her name was Bjorn Gudrun Bjorg Runolfsson. And she married a Anderson, which was anglicized from the Icelandic name Bjrnsson. So it's really fun. We have a lot of things going on in the Icelandic organization here in Utah. And I'll let Richard go ahead and start the presentation now and give you some other some Icelandic history. But there's one other thing I want to make mention. Columbus did not discover America first. The Icelanders did. And I want to change that thing, Columbus Day, to something like Iceland Day. Here we go. Here, Richard.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Is this microphone okay? Did you get me started? Okay, we were seeing the right things. I've been involved with the Icelandic Association for a number of years. We'll get into that. But talking about how old the Icelandic presence is in Utah, Spanish Fork is the second oldest Icelandic settlement in North America. The oldest was Vinland, but they didn't last. Spanish Fork is next, and it's a permanent Icelandic settlement. So the oldest anywhere, the oldest Icelandic settlement in North America. Pardon me. We'll talk there. The history of Iceland reveals that there were two emigration cycles from Iceland. The first is the one that brought people to Spanish Fork and for a period of time after that. And the people who came to Spanish Fork from Iceland came for almost entirely religious purposes. Although I think even your family, they started the Lutheran Church in Spanish Fork after they got here. But they were quite happy to be here from what I've understood anyway. But nearly all of the converts came because they joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and emigrated here for religious purposes. That's a very different purpose from all the other immigrations that we'll mention briefly. And so that's why when I make this presentation, I talk about the faith of the fathers and that connection to the land of the fathers. Most of us who are descendants from those settlers have a history in the LDS Church. Oops. Is this going to work for me? It's not. What do I need here? Oh, okay. Hey, it did. All right. There are some insights that we can share with other Icelandic associations. We came a generation before any of the other immigrations, and we'll speak about that. So the Icelandic settlement is a whole generation older than most of the other immigrations. And again, we're unique because almost everyone came as a matter of faith to be with a new faith. And those who didn't seem to have thrived as well. So the question is always, how do we keep an Icelandic heritage alive? And the same could be said, I mean, I'm 14/16 Danish. How do you keep that alive? Or a Norwegian heritage? How do we do that? And so I hope we can have some insights about that as we go along. And how do we express its value to ourselves into the next generation? That's always the struggle, to keep that heritage alive and pass it on to the next generation. The Scandinavia, the Icelandic immigration to Utah was part of a much larger Scandinavian immigration to Utah. I'll skip over to the next slide. Between 1850 and 1905, some 30,000 proselytes from Scandinavian countries came to Utah. You see the statistics there. About over half of them were Danish, about a third Swedish, 10% Norwegian, and 400 Icelanders. Okay. That's the total. We did the statistics. David Ashby, whom some of you may know, helped with this, but the estimate has been made that from those 400 Iceland, there may be as many as 200,000 descendants who have that Icelandic heritage from those 400 people. Keep in mind the Transcontinental Railroad went through in 1869, and that changed the nature of the immigration, but we'll talk about that a little bit. I found this book a few years ago that talks about the immigration from Scandinavia. And I found it very enlightening. It told the stories, and for the first time, I understood that my own family was almost a complete picture of everything that they talk about in that book. I also found a picture of my great-grandfather that I had known existed. It was included in that book. But Mulder's book is very good for those of you who have a Scandinavian heritage. You might want to look at that source. The period between 1825 and 1860, by some accounts, is the period of Iceland's greatest prosperity. The crops were good, the fishing industry was good, they were getting more and more political autonomy, and it was great. Many of the early converts came from a small island off the southern coast of Iceland named Vestmannaeyjar, or the Westman Islands. That's where my great-great-grandfather lived. He has a farm there. I met and your folks too. The majority actually came from Vestmannaeyjar. I met the mayor of West Vestmannaeyjar a few years ago, and he happens to own the property where my great-great-grandfather's farm is. And I think the last count was it's under 40 feet of lava right now. So not a productive farm. So between 1825 and 1860 was the period of immigration. The earliest successful immigration from Iceland occurred in 1855, left in 54, arrived in 55. So the mayor's question to me, why did he leave then? That was the best time. Life was good. He had his own farm. What was going on? And that's what I had to say. For him and his family and most who left at that time, it was a religious quest. They wanted to be with the saints of their new religion. The second period of immigration started in about 1873. And this was a period of great economic and social difficulty. So this is the second migration. And in contrast with the 400 who left in this first migration, that was largely LDS, the second migration involved somewhere between a quarter and maybe a third of the entire population of Iceland. They left. The original Icelander, well, it's hard to say because from my experience, at least, where you're from is where you were living most recently, because the Danes, the Swedes, and the Norwegians moved a lot. I think the first colonization, Leif Erikson, and so forth, was from Norway, sailing west. So it was a heavily Norwegian heritage, but by that time they were pretty mixed as far as I understand it. The Icelandic language is similar to Scandinavian languages in general, but the Icelanders can actually, many of them can read Old Norse, which Danes and Swedes and Norwegians for the most part can't, because their Nordic language has been isolated for so many years and it has not changed and evolved. That's why it's a real tongue twister, as John pointed out.
Is that a Viking heritage?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's a Viking heritage. So, yep, they were Vikings who came. They went on to Vinland, couldn't make it, but still that heritage. Yes. Well, there's some debate about what it really meant, but Vinland was a place of vines, grapes, wild grapes, or wild fruit that could be grown, which is what they found there. And at that time, it wasn't too strange because they were growing grapes and so forth in Scandinavia during that same time. The weather patterns have shifted back and forth a bit from that. But that's the origin of the name, was Vinland, northern Canada, probably Newfoundland as far as I can tell. So anyway, this second migration, I'll find that slide, was motivated by a number of things. There was an extensive livestock kill-off in 1859. I don't know what it was, disease of some sort. There was a social system that still made it, there was still indentured service going on. And many poor people could not afford to support their children. And so they would actually indenture their children to work for the rich landowners. So you could choose indenture your children or have a real tough go or leave. Okay. And so that was another area. Some people in 1860 migrated to South America. There's still an Icelandic colony in Brazil. 1875, a volcanic eruption ruined many farms and a lot of grazing land in the north and in the east. A cold snap of several years. And cold snaps have a different meaning in Iceland than they do here. Anyways, thousands made the decision to leave. They were at this time considered traitors because in spite of the economic troubles, Iceland was getting closer and closer and closer to independence from, I think at this time, Denmark. So it peaked in 1876. That year, about between 1,300 and 1,400 Icelanders left. But between there, like I say, anywhere from a fifth to a third of the population immigrated. Where did they go? Well, they sought a similar climate that they could find. And besides that, there was free farmland in southern Canada and many places in the northern United States. And so that's these, I wanted to get the names of the settlements, but I couldn't find a slide that I could put it on. But there are Icelandic settlements along the southern border of Canada. Manitoba is the most populated by Icelanders. Still many towns that are largely Icelandic. Northern North Dakota and Minnesota. Along through there, many little towns and colonies. So they came to farm, they had land, and life was ever so much better here than it was in those days. But Utah's on the map because of the colony there, but they were now well along and well integrated into society by this time. I have here a reference to an organization called Icelandic Roots. I know the person who is the head of this organization, Suna Furstenau, and it's not a free site for your genealogy, but it's the best site for Icelandic genealogy and all things Icelandic culture. I've got the web address there for Icelandic Roots, and so I'm not plugging it or working for it, but if you have any interest, it's just icelandicroots.com, and they have a lot of information, a lot of cultural stuff. Well, back to Iceland and the first immigration. Gentleman by the name of Guðmundur Guðmundsson was the first Icelander we know to join the church. He went to Danish to learn the art of jewelry making, and happened to be in Denmark and walking down the street and heard a man preaching, and he said the Spirit told him, "This man's telling the truth, you better listen." And so he was baptized in Denmark, I think, in 1851, and then returned home to Vestmannaeyjar shortly after that. The second was Thorarinn Hálfliðsson. I'm not very good. Who was a friend of his who'd gone to learn cabinet making. And Guðmundur talked with him, and he joined the church too. And those two went back to the Westman Islands together and began to proselyte themselves. So on June 19th of 1853, that's only 5 years after the official church proselyting in Scandinavia had begun in 1850. They organized the first branch of the church there, and Elder Guðmundsson was the branch president. Now that's that to me is significant because the first converts left in 1854. So that's only after a year after the church had been formally organized there. So the two, there was one couple, I think, who left Iceland with the intent of going to Utah. And for some reason, I've never found the history, they didn't make it. The first successful immigration to Utah was by Samuel and Margaret Bjrnsson. They left with a friend, Helga Jonsdóttir. They left the Westman Islands in 1854 and went to Liverpool. And they left on January 1855 in the Naismith. I think I've got that right there. That's the boat. And arrived in the Salt Lake Valley in September of 1855. Now, they were sent from the Salt Lake Valley to Spanish Fork. And the story is always that Brigham Young sent the Icelanders to Spanish Fork because there were already lots of Danes there. Figuring they'd get along. A, they didn't get along. But B, subsequent research has suggested there weren't any Danes in Spanish Fork at the time. So the Icelanders may have been the first Scandinavian settlers there. So we don't know why Brother Brigham sent them there. But one of my interests in Iceland and the history is that this is my great-great-grandfather. He was the first successful immigrant to come to Spanish Fork. Pardon? There are a couple others, but not very many pictures. Again, there's the ship, just the chronology of their immigration. I made this presentation in an organization of Icelanders from the second wave from Canada and Northern America, and just wanted to let them know kind of what the travel was like back then. So they left in late 1854 to Liverpool, had to wait around till January of 1855 to set sail. They were at sea almost 2 months, landed in New Orleans. That was the point of entry at that time because it was a whole lot cheaper. They took then a riverboat up to Mormon Grove near Kansas City. Okay. And in June, now they've been on the road 6 months, they departed for Salt Lake Valley, arriving on September 7th of 1855, a distance of 1,042 miles just from Kansas to Salt Lake Valley. And then shortly after that, and I don't have an exact date, they were settled down in Spanish Fork. Yeah. Not a very big ship for a 2-month journey. The question was how many people were on the ship, and I don't know. I haven't chased down that particular. I know it's in the index. You can look it up. There's a chronology of immigration. I think most companies were 200 to 300 by the time you cover the British saints who were coming, and that was the point of departure for Scandinavian saints. By the time they all met and left, I think, as I say, the average company was 200 or 300. Some a little bigger, some a little smaller, but that's not a big boat. So it was intimate, shall we say. We like to note that Spanish Fork became officially a city in 1855. So this family of Icelandic converts were among the founding settlers of the city of Spanish Fork. So the founding of Spanish Fork and the arrival of the Icelandic immigrants happened at the same time in the same year. So I'd like to remind people, Spanish Fork is the first and oldest permanent Icelandic settlement in North America. Only Vinland is older, but it's not permanent. So we have that honor. I've always wanted the city to make more of that. This is the oldest permanent settlement of Icelanders in North America. We don't need to see the map. Now, I'd like to give a little flavor for what it was like to come from Iceland to Spanish Fork, and then even worse than that, down Emery County, where I grew up, and that family ended up. Here is a picture of Icelandic countryside. Quite attractive. I think we'd like to take a walk or have a picnic there. And another Icelandic countryside scene. This is an Icelandic horse. That's a separate breed, by the way, and they're very protective. They don't just let anybody take a horse out of the country. My folks were also Danish, so I've got some Danish countryside here for us to enjoy. My one branch that's not Scandinavian came from England, in generally southwestern England. My great-great-grandfather was from Hartland Point in England. There's Hartland Point. And then, because of a colonizing call that we'll talk about in a minute, some of these converts ended up in Emery County, Utah. I've been to where this picture is taken, by the way. There are countless stories, and you know them as well as I do, of women coming from England and from Scandinavia weeping so while they're sitting in the wagon when they survey the countryside of their new home. My hometown of Castledale looks like 100 or so other small settlements in Utah. You get a school building built right away. This is natural landscape. Rutger Clausen, one of the general authorities of the church at the time, used to go out and travel broadly on various kinds of missions and assignments. And he once commented on the land in Emery County. He said, "It's so poor that more a man is possessed of it, the poorer he is for it. The more land you own, the worse off you are." Okay. This is what you had to do to get irrigation water down to the town in some of those towns. And you know, your families have these similar stories. I'm just pointing them out for the contrast of where they came from. This is a little, they didn't have any color in Emery County till the 1940s, I think, but now we got color pictures. Small towns there. And this is where my branch of the family ended up, was in Emery County. I know, well, I'll get to that in just a minute. So here's the Spanish Fork settlement. Samuel and Margaret Bjrnsson. Not too long after the settlement, as it was the practice, those who had the means to do it were called to or able to enter into a second marriage or a third. And so I have a second grandmother. She's a Danish woman, Gertrude Marie. She went by Mary, so we have Grandma Margaret and Grandma Mary. And there are every family, many families in Utah have stories about the plural marriage years. Some of them are very good and some of them are very bad. I've got a good one, so we'll talk about part of that in a minute. This is the home in Spanish Fork that Samuel built. This was an upstairs downstairs arrangement with the two plural wives. Yes. Oh, there you go. Yeah, this was an upstairs and downstairs. This is Grandma Mary, I think. Well, Grandma Mary's in the wheelchair. Grandma Margaret's standing up. Grandma Margaret cared for Grandma Mary for 20 years after their husband passed away, so that she was able to live at home and stay at home. Then she herself lived 20 years more. So that was a good family story. Another part of this, just for local color, Margaret and Samuel had one daughter, lived about a year, and they buried her in Westanayer before they came. It was Grandma Margaret who bore all the children. And I've always thought that if that were not possible at the time, this older couple from Iceland would have been familyless. And one of our touching family stories, the first boy who was born, Grandma Margaret gave to Grandma Mary to raise as her son. So this is one of the good stories, and it all works out very well. I realize there are bad stories, so I'm not advocating. This is just a touch of the color. Your family all has stories here. You get a little glimpse here of childbirth and rearing at the time, as you notice. All of these children were from Grandma Margaret. Only these lived to adulthood. They buried so many young children, and they're all in the Spanish Fork cemetery. But that was life at that period of time. Abraham Samuel Bjrnsson was my great-grandfather. That's him as a boy with Grandma Mary. And as was the custom also in that period of time, latter part of the 19th century in Utah, there were colonizing calls. And so Brigham Young made a call to colonize and the what they called Blue Valley. This is down in Wayne County, in the Hanksville area, from Hanksville over toward Loa down there. So Samuel and his son, Abraham, and their families, one of the wives, Margaret, went down. I think Mary stayed in Spanish Fork. They went down and colonized Blue Valley. And so that was about after his mission back to, they colonized down there. And he sold everything but his houses in Spanish Fork to be able to do that. So there was a lot at stake in that. His son Abraham and his new wife Caroline joined them there. And it was these colonizing calls that spread the Icelandic converts to the Farron and Cleveland, Emery County area for my family, to the Rexburg area. There was, I think, a branch in Canada, and in various, there are pockets of Icelanders in various parts of the Western United States. Well, after several years of alternating floods and droughts, okay, they had to abandon. I've never been there, but this is a picture of the Blue Valley area. This is, again, you can contrast that with Iceland or Denmark or England. Okay, this was going to be the hotel. This is the hotel there. I like to joke. It's serious, true, but I like to joke about. There is an organization that conducts experiments and practices for a Mars mission. Guess where they practice? That area of Wayne County. So that's what it's for. So in 1890, Samuel went home to Spanish Fork, where his daughter lived, and they became seriously ill. And it was fatal, and he died in 1890 at the age of 67. And he's buried there in the Spanish Fork Cemetery. And I copy this because, of course, is my great-great-grandfather, kind and generous. He helped other colonists. And this, as I say, this isn't the story. You've all got these stories if your families joined the church at that point. This is just mine. But I didn't have it all together until I made a conscious effort to do it. So I recommend gathering these stories, gathering these things together. His son, Abraham, left Blue Valley also, and he's the one that ended up down in Farron, down where I grew up, and his daughter married my grandfather, and that's how we got to be there. Your families probably have some of these too. This is the only picture ever taken of him. Where was it taken? In the coffin. It's a coffin shot. Okay. Yeah, for us, this was known as this is our grandpa, the dead guy. That's how we remembered that picture. And here is their oldest son. Died there in Blue Valley, and in the Blue Valley Cemetery. I found a picture of this headstone. You can see the surrounding ground there in that area. Well, the peak exodus for Latter-day Saint Icelanders was 1886. The peak for baptisms and integration. The Icelandic Association of Utah was established in 1897. And Iceland Days has been a yearly celebration ever since. Now, COVID took a bite out of that, and we haven't quite got it back together every time. But and in the last few decades, starting I think in the early 70s, they've celebrated a feast that's near the end of winter called Thorrablot. we've tried to replicate that. We send out tickets and people come to Thorablot and they do cultural things, and it's a good time. We usually manage to bring over what we call the stinky food, which is lye cured shark and other gross things that we wouldn't ordinarily eat, just to sample some of the cuisine. They call it the Torah mater. You can sample those things usually at Thorablot. Recently the association has started to hold a Christmas party because Christmas celebrations are fun in Iceland, and we've been able to have the Yule lads come and have a Christmas party. So one year I think we do a Christmas party, and the next year is a Thorablot. So we won't have a Thorablot this year, but next year we will. Well, in 1914, the LDS mission in Iceland was closed. There are still missionaries there from the Danish mission, but it was closed until 1965. And in 1965, there was a church unit there, but it was on the Air Force Base in Keflavik. And it was a whole decade before the missionary work, specifically in Iceland, would reopen. In 1938, a monument was erected in Spanish Fork. Somebody know the address? What is it, 4 South? Yeah, about 8th East, right there. It's after the manner of a lighthouse. There's a Viking ship on top. The names of some of the earliest settlers are on the monument, and that was dedicated in the Icelandic Days celebration in 1938. There's as late as 1955, here's an entry in the Iceland Days parade of people born in Iceland. Okay, still a carful of people born in Iceland. 1975, Bjorn Bjrnsson was sent to labor in Iceland and see if we could start the LDS church again. He took 2 of his sons with him who just barely finished missions, one in Korea and one in Japan. So they just finished their missions and started another one there. And Bjrnsson is the best known person in Iceland connected with the LDS church. The mid-20th century, a Nobel Prize winning author, Halldór Laxness, visited Utah to do research on a book he wrote about some of the early LDS converts called Paradise Reclaimed. It was one of those, they came back to Iceland stories, but he came here to do the research. And there's a whole article in that, if that's of interest to you, there's a reference there. This is Brother Bjrnsson. And to honor his visit here, they gave him a framed picture, which is this one, that he hung above his desk while he was writing his book. And I'm almost 100% sure that's my great-great-grandmother. So that's been a good favorite picture for me. Well, because of the Icelandic community, there was an official honorary consul established in Spanish Fork. The first started in 1880 or 1989. The first consul was Thorleifsson. He would be followed by Clark T. Thorstensen. And then the final one was Brent Haymond. He was the last one because they discontinued those honorary consuls. They had them in several places. They abandoned them everywhere but in the largest cities. But for a while, we had our own honorary consul from Iceland. Some of you know David Ashby and his wife. They were just essential figures in the development of the Icelandic Association. He's written a number of histories. He still knows more than, he's forgotten more than I have ever known. I think I could make a case that his mother was the last person who spoke Iceland at home in the family. And that's not too long ago. Okay, that persisted quite a while. One of the things that the association has been able to do is establish good relationships with the Icelandic government. That was helped because of a wonderful gentleman who was elected president. President Bjrnsson was elected president of Iceland. And after the first formally organized trip that the Icelandic Association sponsored to Iceland, there they met President Bjrnsson. And shortly after that, he came out to Spanish Fork for a visit. And it was about that time, in connection with that visit, that we understood their word for us is Western Icelanders. Okay, we're the Western us and all the people in Manitoba and around about, but we're Western Icelanders. So that's a common phrase that we use. We're still Icelanders. We just moved west a ways. So he made that visit, met the leaders of the church, and then we established a lot of friendships. Another important thing, in the year 2000, some donors from here and some hard work by people in Iceland, they were able to erect a monument near what's called Mormon Bay on Vestmannaeyjar. This is the place where the LDS Church did its baptisms in Iceland. Mormon Bay, and on the shore there of Mormon Bay, they erected this monument. You can't see it here, but that's an angel. Okay, with and they wrote the names of every person who left Iceland to come to Spanish Fork on that monument. John?
Well, I was just thinking about that, being baptized over there in Iceland in the ocean there. And since Iceland is just slightly below the Arctic Circle, that water is very cold.
Yeah, well, it is a warm current. That's how they've survived. It is a warm current, but it's not for the faint of heart. Right here.
I've been thinking about something I learned a long time ago about the climate, and it is that Iceland isn't icy and Greenland isn't green.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
just because we call it Iceland, we shouldn't assume
Yeah.
that it's an icy country.
The best story that I've heard, well, it is cold in the winter, but there is comings and goings. The best story about that I've ever heard is that Ericsson did not want a lot of people following him. So he described it in very poor terms and named it Iceland, hoping that they would go to Greenland and settle, and not. I don't know whether that's true, but if it's not, it ought to be, right?
Can you tell me about the transportation between Denmark and Iceland? Was that quite a arduous trip? Because
Yeah.
the young men would go to Denmark for education, and Denmark had quite an influence on them in that they governed them.
Yeah, it's a substantial trip by sea. It's for a number of years. It's not, they've navigated the North Sea, but it's never fun. My grandfather was a mission president in Norway, and he'd have to go all the way around and visit all the churches, and he got seasick and he hated that trip. So it wasn't a fun journey. It's not a pleasure cruise by any means. But yeah, and they didn't have a lot of liking for the Danes anyway. So you're right about that. So the monument is a fun place to visit.
Let me ask a question.
Okay.
So I've seen a couple Icelandic television shows, and they seem to be rather friendly with the Danes. I mean,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So what was the point of contention?
Well, they have a lot of self-government now. They have, yeah.
So they used to be controlled by the Danes?
They were controlled by the Danes, and before that, the Norwegians, and before that, yeah, it's a relatively recent thing. And the Danes were not, they didn't quit easily, shall we say, so it took a long time.
I want to share something that I learned by coming to Elder Quest about language and the significance of why we have different cultures. They were talking about Russia and China. It was last year. And I raised my hand and asked, well, how does the Tower of Babylon fit into all of this? And everyone laughed, so I laughed too. But here's what I found out. I had a significant spiritual experience, and I found out that Heavenly Father, I know we're not supposed to talk religion in here that much, but there is a reason why we're in different languages and different cultures. And when we say that the Danes don't like the Iceland people, or the Iceland people don't like them, we don't need to get hung up on that, because Heavenly Father designed it that when he had the when he changed the languages, and how he changed it was not immediate. It happened gradually. And so it was just so awesome to know and to finally understand how these differences are still ongoing and that there's a purpose for it.
And just to note that even when the converts arrived in Spanish Fork, anybody know which section of Spanish Fork was the Iceland section? East bench, the East bench out there. So they tended to, it can separate people, but it can also unify them. And so those two folks. Yeah. Well, I got to hurry here. So they established a museum up on the north coast in Hulsels. I'm not sure it's still in operation. The most meaningful achievement for many Utah Icelanders was the dedication of a chapel in Reykjavik in 2000. That's a long time from first convert to first chapel, isn't it? There's some pictures of President Bjrnsson again. He was a very good friend for these. 2005 was the Suska centennial of the arrival of the first Icelandic converts in Spanish Fork, and of the settlement of Spanish Fork itself. So the city cooperated quite a bit for that sesquicentennial celebration. President Bjrnsson came. President Hinckley from the LDS Church came, and they rededicated what had been the monument. They transformed it into a larger thing. And you see in the background behind the lighthouse, which has been there since 1938, is a replica of that same slab and the angel that's on the Westman Ayer near Mormon Bay, Mormon Cove. So that still stands, and it's worth a visit. For the sesquicentennial, a painting was commissioned. This is not a literal photograph. This is, of course, stylized. Just to follow through, this is my own family history. You have your own. Samuel Bjarnsson's granddaughter, Margaret, named after his second wife, was my grandmother. And just as there were mission calls from Scandinavians, Icelanders, and others to go back, my grandmother was able to go back to Norway with her husband and serve 3 missions. This is a family picture. There's my mom in the background looking over President Grant's shoulder. So what's the composition of my heritage? And again, you all have a heritage. I know you do in your families somewhere. Familial and cultural artifacts that give color and flavor to life and bind us to a place far away and people long past. Respect for the character and qualities and tenure shown in the lives of those who left here, even and they stayed even when the going was tough. We collect things and keep them as a physical tie to the best blessings of an older land and the blessings of our newer land. An expanded view and understanding of the past, which gives an extended view and understanding of the present and the future. So in my own personal life, I grew up loving Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. My mother served 2 missions there, one mission and a girl. One time as a little girl, that's the stories I had. I had magical artifacts. I don't think they were made of wood and wool and silver and fur. How many little boys in rural Utah grew up with a little seal made out of real seal skin? Or a pouch made of reindeer skin full of strange coins, just wonderful things for a little boy. I grew up loving what we call Swedish pancakes, what the Icelanders called pannukakor. Very thin crepes, and then you load them up with everything you shouldn't eat. And I grew up, I think my record, I don't think I ever ate more than 10 or 12 at one sitting.
Eat more than that.
And I grew up with stories of my feisty Icelandic grandmother and her earthy, shall we say, Scandinavian expressions. They talk very plainly to each other over there. And a finely sharpened tongue, and no opinion was held lightly. One of the stories, when they were serving as mission presidents, she picked up a pillow and continued to beat one of the missionaries that didn't want to get up and go to work until he agreed to do so. So I attribute some of that to Iceland heritage. So I grew up knowing my ancestors left their homes and carved out new ones for future generations because of what they believed and what they believed was best for the future. I grew up knowing that they gave freely of time and treasure for their faith and their family. I don't want to be the weak link in that.
You haven't said anything about how beautiful these people are. For many years, I was a portrait artist and I traveled all through Scandinavia, and the further north I went, I could not believe how beautiful the men and women were. The women were 6 feet tall and the little kids ate vegetables for lunch. I couldn't believe it. They were so clean cut and so healthy and so gorgeous. But you haven't said one word about how beautiful your people are.
Well, when I went to Scandinavia the first time, that's the only place in the world I fell short. Okay. Not one of the shorter guys around. Yeah, they were, and we've had exchanges, and that's one of the things the association does. We send students over there, they come back, we entertain them here. We've had touring choirs and other things. We keep a pretty close contact. So I introduce here the importance of this heritage. UtahIcelanders.com is the homepage. Yeah, that slide didn't get in. UtahIcelanders.com is the homepage of that if you're interested and want to keep track of what we're doing. As I say, there are 200,000 of us out there. We're trying to keep us all together. Thank you for your time.
Okay, we got a couple of questions for you.
Okay.
Right here. Here we go.
So, when do they have the Icelandic days or whatever that is? I hear it on the news, but it's usually that they had that last weekend. Is there a way to find out ahead of time?
Sometimes they do it in conjunction with Spanish Fort Days, which is the Fiesta Days in Spanish Fort. which is the last in June, I think, the last Saturday in June. But UtahIcelanders.com will have the dates up for that. And the Thora bloat usually third week of February. And then the Christmas one will vary according to the month. But yeah, just get on that site and the calendar's there.
Did you, I missed part of the first because I was in another conference. What's the language for Iceland? And,
Icelandic,
okay, how's your Icelandic?
lousy.
Well, let's hear a lousy Icelandic, if you would, please. You can have the sharp tongue in this if you want.
If I had some names to read, they're really quite extraordinary. They're long, and as in most Scandinavian countries, they do pronounce their vowels. My grandfather is Samuel Bjornsson.
There we go. Anybody want to try that other than him? Okay, I didn't think so. Whoop, 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 whoop.
I honestly don't know. I've not immersed myself in that. For a while, we had a young man who was going to BYU who offered free Icelandic language lessons for a while, but
Oh, wow. Okay.
hasn't done it anymore.
Any other questions? Glenn's always got a question.
Tell me how to pronounce the name of that Reykjavik capital city.
Reykjavik,
Huh?
Reykjavik,
Reykjavik.
yep, Reykjavik.
You got to roll the R.
It's somewhere between a roll and a gargle, but
Reykjavik.
Reykjavik.
Thank you.
She puts a
They-
German
They
emphasis on
almost
that one.
never pronounce the last K on it's Vic, but it's Reykjavik most of the time.
Any other questions for
There's
him?
a J there, so it's a yeah, Reykjavik. Reykjavik.
Well, this has been wonderful. Just as I started out, I wanted to mention, like you would ask the language, trying to pronounce my grandmother's name. Thorin Gudrun Bjorg Runolfsson. And of course, she had married another person named Bjornsson, and they transferred it to the English Anderson. And my mother, she didn't speak Icelandic around us, except when she got upset. But my mother would always break and make these, what I call claners. They were like really heavy donuts. They were really, really good. I mean, they were awesome. She did this about every 6 months, and we just loved them. My grandmother had a little kind of a quirk that we loved. She called it the candy spider. That's what a lot of us have, these little kind of traits. And she would have the candy spider in the house, and we would follow it. And it was just absolutely wonderful. One thing to think about, Icelanders, if you think of Iceland, I want to give you kind of an idea. Iceland has a population about the size of Utah County. And Iceland has about, I think 60% of the population believe in little people. So well that if they're in a construction project, if you want to look it up online, if there's a boulder in the way and there's problems, they will appease the pixies and dwarfs and to make sure they don't have any accidents. And they have also these kind of interesting traits over there in Iceland about taking care of the pixies and dwarfs and the trolls. So I'd like to end it with that right there, unless you got any other questions.
There we go. Round of applause for learning about Iceland. Appreciate you this week. We've got tomorrow. We've got some great classes. Come back. Have a great afternoon, everybody.